Welcome to day one of our EV Connection presented by EVI Microconference. We're so happy to have you. This new segment of North America Smart Energy Week will outline critical components of creating comprehensive regional EV roadmaps, strategic approaches to EV charging, equity and electric transportation, and more. This session will be focusing on creating a comprehensive EV roadmap. I am joined today by 4 participants on our panel: Matt Alford, who's the Executive Director of Drive Electric Florida; John Bossel, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of CalStart; Chris Nelder, Manager of EV Grid Initiative at Rocky Mountain Institute; Elizabeth Turnbull, who's the Product Developer for Electric Mobility for Portland General Electric. We have 30 minutes to discuss different questions that we've pulled together in advance of this session, and we'll go ahead and get started. So with each of the speakers, if you answer the question, if you could give a brief introduction of what you're doing as it relates to this topic, that would be fantastic. So our first question is, what is a utility EV roadmap and how does it work? Who is responsible for it and how do stakeholders get involved? And to the extent that you can provide a good example of a roadmap, please do. So we'll start today with Elizabeth.
Great, thanks, Erica. So I have our PGE's Transportation Electrification Plan here. I'm sort of I prefer to have things on paper, so it's been a very good resource for me. So we issued this Transportation Electrification Plan in 2019. And what it does is it really outlines the importance of transportation electrification, not only for climate and creating value for utility customers, but also it establishes what we think the utility role is in all of that. So this was through a regulatory process. So our commission issued specifications of what the plan should include, and that was developed, in consultation with stakeholders. And it really assesses, starting from, what's the current state of transportation electrification, from policy to vehicles and charging, within the service territory at the moment. And then what are the activities that we're currently working on? And then what do we envision for our future activities? And what might the system impacts of those be? So again, this was through the regulatory process. So there was, an opportunity for interveners to get involved and respond. That said, the commission, I believe the word they used was to accept the plan. It wasn't an approval of the plan. And any specific programmatic activities or offerings that are sort of referenced in the plan have to go through their own approval processes from the commission. So this is really the sort of the overarching strategy document of how we see transportation electrification at Portland General Electric.
And really kind of to hone in on that a little bit, can you explain how the stakeholders got involved in providing input directly to PGE?
Yeah, so there were sort of 2 areas where that happened informally. And the first was, the commission had a very specific list of things that should be included in the plan. And there was a process around developing that rule. So stakeholders were able to say, we think that the utilities should provide this information or that information, and sort of that there was that formal piece. And then once we submitted the plan, interveners had the opportunity to formally, petition to intervene and then respond. And we got some really interesting responses, some interesting, I think, approaches to how stakeholders are thinking about transportation electrification. And because this wasn't an approval of a program or an offering specifically, it was more, I would say it was more of a conversation sort of held within the regulatory space about what the utility role is in advancing TE.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Chris, I know you have worked on roadmaps for different utilities and other stakeholders around the country. Can you expand a little bit on what you think of as an EV roadmap and what might be a good roadmap based on your experience?
Yeah, for sure. you know, I think the most important thing in a utility roadmap is to make sure it's specific. Otherwise, you wind up with sort of a roadmap to nowhere. So instead of, you know, high level objectives or high level language, to try to be very specific about exactly what you're going to do and who you're going to do it with and when. So for example, I think a great utility roadmap is one where it's clear who's making what kind of investments, and, you know, how a utility, for example, might be sharing some of the cost of the make ready, for example, for charging stations, that kind of thing. And then also to work directly with some of the major customers. So I think fleet engagement is a really important aspect that utilities need to start focusing on here. And I will probably get into that a little deeper in a minute, but I think utilities really need to include in their roadmaps a specific and deliberate outreach program to make sure that they're contacting their major fleet customers well in advance of those customers needing grid capacity for their charging infrastructure, so that they have visibility that that load is coming onto their system, that they know when it'll be showing up and about how much, and that they can then include that in their IRPs, because of course, you know, the IRP process is pretty slow. You know, if you need suddenly, you know, another 20 megawatts of power supply for a bus barn or something of that sort, maybe 40, maybe more, you need, you know, a year or two worth of visibility on that if you're a utility to start planning for that capacity. So that's the kind of thing that I think really needs to be in a utility roadmap. You know, make ready programs are really a key element of all that, I think. Um, I would also say that, you know, stakeholder engagement is not something that you just say and then stop there. You really need to be very specific about who are the stakeholders and what does that engagement look like.
Thanks, Chris. And this actually segues really nicely to Matt, who is in the process of developing an EV roadmap in Florida. And granted, Matt, you don't work for a utility, but you have worked with every utility in the state of Florida. And so could you provide some insight into the process you guys have been going through and how you think stakeholder engagement has been really critical in getting to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you know, we are a member-driven organization, so we have a ton of different stakeholders. You know, everyone from Florida Power and Light, Duke, Energy Florida, all the way down to your rural co-ops. So, you know, just from the perspective of, you know, giving them sort of a safe space to discuss what direction they're going to go. Florida, I'm very fond of saying that we sort of, you know, if we're not on an intellectual island, we're like kind of on a peninsula that's separated from much of the work that's going on in the country. So, you know, in terms of standing on the shoulders of giants, I've used works that Chris has written, Erica, that you've written, looked at some of the stuff CalSTART has done. But yeah, getting them to focus on consumer experience, fleets, distribution and design, permitting, and just letting them understand, right, that this is a new and nascent field. You don't necessarily have to know the answer in advance, but let's define the what, right? And then sort of the why and the how, that falls into place. You know, just from my perspective, the single most important consideration is, you know, empowering our members to provide, you know, feedback, not shying away from the uncertainty, not shying away from disagreement. You can really use those discussions to tease out areas of similarity and find the highest common denominator, and then pursue strategies around that. So that really, I think, can help build a strong team, which really, you know, it makes the team better, but it also makes you better if you're looking at, you know, ways to sort of combine all of the different stakeholders' inputs, and then adjust to the resources that members have, right? So different utilities are starting from different places. They've got different capacities. If you show up and you say rate design, you know, high growth, near-term market segments, you know, some of them, their eyes are going to glaze over. So go to where folks are, bring them to where you're at. Let them know that there aren't necessarily wrong answers. There's just, you know, different ways to build capacity and develop some core competencies. So that's really been a lot of the work that we focused on here, and working with regulators, working with policymakers, working with internal utility folks, kind of saying, where are the pain points? Where are areas that this has gone well? Where are areas that this has gone poorly? And then synthesizing that and sort of setting some discrete deadlines. That's really been sort of the focus here primarily for Drive Electric Florida over the near term.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. And finally, John, CalSTAR has worked with entities across the country and across the world on implementing electric vehicles for light, medium, and heavy duty. And we know medium and heavy duty have their own set of particular challenges. And from a planning perspective, what do you guys see, and where have you seen some best practices that would contribute to the folks who are listening right now?
Great. Thanks, Erica. John Bozell, President and CEO of CalSTAR. We're an industry organization. We have about 260 member companies throughout the United States. We have offices in California, Colorado, Michigan, and New York. And in all the places we work with, we work very closely with electric utilities. I think as we look forward to growing the clean transportation industry, the electric utilities have a critical role to play in fostering the growth of this new industry. The opportunity is enormous as we move ahead, and we see tremendous market growth potential here in this decade. We need utilities to be active partners. And to do that, they need to have a good roadmap, a plan on how to get there. And I think we've seen some great ones. Great to have Elizabeth here, and Portland General Electric is doing some really good work. I'd also point to Southern California Edison has done some really fantastic work for not only developing a roadmap for light duty vehicles, but trucks and buses and non-road equipment. With that roadmap in place, they've gone ahead and gotten commission approval at the state level to use ratepayer dollars to invest in make-ready systems. So they can bring the power to the fleets, to the end user, then the end user gets to control that power. But the utility is there, they're an active partner, and they're an investor. And this is so important. We're actively working. We'd like to see other utility commissions around the country support similar policies. We think it's important really to have utilities there as partners. And particularly as it relates to this conference, I want to say that I think the roadmap should include the active involvement of renewable energy. How do we not only have a roadmap for transportation, electric transportation, but making sure that the power for those vehicles comes from renewable sources. Increasingly, if fleet utilities can line that up with renewable portfolio standards and goals to go completely renewable, that's going to be a win for everyone. And it's only through that combination, really, that we're going to hit the climate reduction targets, the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. But then the benefit is incredible. All of a sudden, we're charging our vehicles or transportation system through domestically, locally produced renewable power versus depending on OPEC.
Thanks, John. And I couldn't agree with you more. And given the folks that are on this call, certainly they would be very interested in how they can do that. And I think it'd be great if you could expand on that a little bit with some ideas you may have about how you can use DERs as a complement for especially medium and heavy duty fleet electrification.
So, Erica, it's a great question. So you used an acronym there, DER. Your industry knows that. My industry doesn't really know that term. So, but this is the conversation that needs to start taking place between the renewable sector and the clean transportation sector. And I'm actually really glad you used that acronym, because we need to come together, and the opportunity is really enormous. What I'm getting really excited about is the opportunity for companies to come in and look at the solar model of the purchase power agreement. I think particularly on the fleet side, we're getting these fleets that are wanting to go electric. We're getting really good product now on the trucks and buses and certainly cars as well. But the fleets, it's very challenging for them to understand how to manage electricity. They don't understand demand response. They don't understand storage. So I think we're seeing on the part of a number of our member companies going to come in and manage demand response, storage, put that all together in a purchase power agreement. So we've got some really big companies that are coming to us with these kind of models. And I think there's really a lot of great potential there to work with utilities to provide that full service to fleets in particular.
So if a solar company who's on the line was like, oh, I know a lot about solar PPAs, how does that directly translate into what you're just describing? Or does it?
Well, I think we're just at a point where industry is coming forward and assessing this opportunity and saying, okay, we want to do this. We don't have a lot of systems being rolled out there. There are a few. There's a company called Amply that is working with some transit properties in California. And they're coming in. These transit properties are going all electric with their bus fleets slowly, but by 2028, all bus fleets in California will have to go electric or zero emission. And Amply is coming in, and with a few of them has said, we'll manage your whole power system. So I would start contacting firms like Amply. There's a small little company that's whose market value is now bigger than ExxonMobil, called NextEra Energy, another CalSTART member. They are, if you go to their Twitter site, they talk about how they've been managing an electric fleet their own since 1988. If they come into the market, that's a big new player. I would think about starting to partner and reach out with some of these firms like them, like ABB, Siemens, and others.
It's great advice. I want to punt this next to Elizabeth. So from Portland General Electric's perspective, are you guys working at integrating distributed energy resources with your fleet programs or other EV programs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a big part of the conversation. So when we issued our transportation electrification plan, we were very explicit upfront about how that fit with both our integrated resource plan as well as our distributed resource plan, and that those three plans kind of operate together to sort of forge the path forward for PGE. And I think that the fleet electrification piece, I mean, for a utility, this is about capturing upside opportunity, obviously, but also managing the downside risk. And unmanaged charging and a bunch of fleets coming on where we're not anticipating them, a lot of, I would call it sort of not very planful infrastructure, that's going to ultimately harm customers and ratepayers rather than benefit. And so we're sort of at the center of all of those information flows and needing to sort of carve out that forward path. On the distributed resource piece, I think that's exactly right. And for me, on the offerings that I'm working on, we're focused on building out that make-ready infrastructure and getting the regulatory approval for that piece. And some of the DER pieces, I think, kind of have to be a little bit secondary to that because the infrastructure piece is so huge and complicated, and we've watched it roll out, utility after utility, and just sort of struggle with it in the first year or two, I would say. So for me right now, and this is just me, not the whole team, but for me right now, I'm focused on that piece. But I know that the DER piece is also a big part of the consideration, and some of the firms that John spoke of, as well as some of the planning, right? The West Coast Clean Transit Corridor Initiative that we and other West Coast utilities worked on to identify, where are the charging sites that we need up and down I-5 for medium and heavy duty charging. And that, I think, all rolls into this question of these planful investments.
Great, thank you. Chris, so she mentioned managed charging. Maybe for folks on the line who aren't familiar with that or vehicle grid integration more broadly, do you mind explaining and then also expanding on where RMI sees distributed energy resources and clean energy fitting into this bigger picture and road mapping process?
Sure. Yeah, for those who aren't familiar, my team at RMI has published half a dozen major reports on EV grid integration, looking at various elements of, how to do it right, how to do it badly. When I think of this question, I think of really the supply side and the demand side separately. So on the demand side, if you do good managed charging, that is charging vehicles when grid supply is ample and inexpensive. In Southern California right now, that's actually in the middle of the day when the solar is cranking out. In some other parts of the country, and most of the rest of the country, frankly, it's going to be at night. So you want to have a utility tariff that rewards people for charging when grid prices are low. And grid supply is ample, and then steers them away from charging when the grid is constrained, and try to keep it away from the peaks of the utility system, of the utility load profile. So that's the first thing. Is it's important to have utility tariffs that really encourage charging at the right time and discourage charging at the wrong time, essentially. And if you do that, you can actually deliver a lot of benefits to everyone, even people who don't drive, because you're actually getting more kilowatt hours out of the same set of fixed assets on the utility system. And that can drive down prices for all ratepayers. So even people who don't drive can benefit from good managed charging. I think your report, Erica, on managed charging of whatever that was a year or so ago was excellent, probably the best report on the subject to date. So I would really encourage people to look at that. And then on the supply side, it's important to understand what, utility resource planning is going to look like, but also what distributed resource development is going to be. As more and more people get rooftop solar, for example, and in the West Coast here, or even here in Colorado, we're increasingly suffering from public safety power shutoffs because of wildfire risk on the transmission system. And that's encouraging the development of more microgrids and distributed storage capacity, and that kind of thing. So if you take all that on board on the supply side, you start to think about some different scenarios about when it really is best to charge a vehicle. For those who have solar and storage on their home or on their business, maybe they can self-consume their solar power generation. For those who can't, they really need to be more aware of what's happening on the utility side. And there, I think everyone understands that transportation electrification is really about addressing the challenge of climate change. And so it's really important to understand what the particular composition of grid power is from hour to hour or even minute to minute, and to, in some degree, be able to steer your charging into the cleaner hours of the grid operation. RMI acquired a company called WattTime about a year or two ago that actually produces data on how clean the grid is from minute to minute or hour to hour, whatever granularity you want, based on its knowledge of which generators are producing power at what time. And you can use that kind of data to develop a utility tariff, or if you're a major customer, you can use that data to steer your own charging into the clean hours of the grid power mix. So it's important to think about the demand side and the supply side of this stuff separately, I think. And also to realize that, there's a limit to how flexible a charger can be, or a particular vehicle's use case can be, depending on what its duty cycle is and so on. Transit buses don't have a choice but to operate on schedule. So you have to really be very careful about how you're planning the charging strategy for those kind of vehicles, and an awareness of what your opportunity is to flex the charging in time and space for different kinds of vehicles is really important if you want to get your utility planning right. And that's really important if you want to produce a low carbon mix of power to run your vehicles on.
Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, that was a great explanation of vehicle grid integration and a lot of other things. And thank you for the shout out for the comprehensive guide to managed charging, which is the report you're referencing. And I do want to point out, we found from a lot of research that the EV buyers are also solar buyers, and lots of data is confirming that, including Energy Sage. And you can go in the Tesla store and that they're upselling the people who buy the Teslas with their Powerwall and their solar roof. And we know that the dynamics of distributed energy resources are changing over time. The values for things like managed charging are evolving over time as a result of this kind of co-development of two totally different industries. And so when we think about future-proofing these roadmaps, without knowing, today the snapshot of what these values are for things like managed charging are going to be different for tomorrow. Matt, I know this is kind of a tough question, but I know that your regulators are thinking about this in Florida. How are they tackling this extremely difficult challenge?
Ooh, that's a good question, actually. I think that there's a lot of enthusiasm for these types of, bidirectional, on-demand, dispatchable sources. I think that, the interest and the enthusiasm has to be tempered with a little bit of education. So here in Florida, and John, I'm glad you brought up NextEra. They actually own Florida Power and Light as well as Gulf, and they're members of Drive Electric Florida. So right now, what they're doing as a part of the energy efficiency and conservation goals that utilities in Florida are required to set, they have got a conservation research and development pilot to Florida Power and Light does, and then a non-NextEra owned utility, Tampa Electric, has a distributed energy resource management system that includes photovoltaic, solar, battery storage, and EV charging capabilities for medium and heavy duty vehicles. So, the way that the regulators are approaching this is to allow the utilities to develop some core competencies outside of a normal petition or rate case. Letting them pilot this is a way to explore methods to shift consumption to daylight hours, right? If we're talking about distributed energy and using electric vehicles as a resource on the grid, there's a lot of potential there. And so I think that the way that the regulators are approaching it is to acknowledge that they don't know what they don't know, and also give the utilities sort of a pathway in an innovative regulatory paradigm to really get a handle on the implications of transportation electrification using some complementary technologies like renewable energy. So I think that has been the approach that has worked best for most of the stakeholders, including the regulators. So that's where we're at right now.
Well, thanks, Matt. I mean, have you guys considered any flexible approaches to regulations that would be a little bit more nimble for this evolving sector?
Yeah, so and that's part of what I think the pilot will do is once the utilities have some of those, core competencies, right? Like these are your active managed charging applications that we feel comfortable with and that might be appropriate in the regulatory context. Once they've sort of developed some of those things, I'd imagine that they will come back to the regulators with a more substantive, discrete set of these are the things that we think we need. We're going to need an EV rate. We're going to need certain tariffs that utilize the findings of our pilots. And so that's been the sort of the 3,000 foot level approach they've taken here so far. And again, it is very early days in Florida, but that gives us an opportunity to look around and take what has gone well in other parts of the world and country and apply them here. So big things are happening, I would say.
Erica, would you mind if I interjected a thought about sort of the value of vehicle grid integration? One of the things that a lot of people that are trying to do sophisticated things with EV grid integration look at is the value stack of, I can get paid this much for providing that grid service and this much for providing that. And a lot of that revolves around what's called ancillary services, frequency control, voltage control, demand response, that kind of thing. But one of the things that I think is not well appreciated is that the more vehicles you get participating in this kind of an ancillary services market, the lower the value of each vehicle's participation goes. So to your earlier point about how everything is changing, that's something that I think is not well appreciated. It's like, if you put the first 10,000 vehicles on a utility system right now providing ancillary services, they're going to get paid pretty well. And when you get 100,000 vehicles, they're not going to get paid hardly anything at all. And we need to really take that into account as we're evaluating the financial opportunity for doing solid and smart grid integration and managed charging.
Wow, that I hadn't thought about. The cost would go down for participation. And
Yeah,
that
I read a report a couple years ago saying that it estimated that it would only take 100,000 vehicles participating in managed charging on the CAISO system on the California grid to completely saturate that grid's ancillary services market.
wow, that isn't very many.
No.
Wow, okay. That's you know, an interesting point and something to earmark, I guess, for future folks out there developing value stacks for vehicle grid integration and for you know, for thinking about roadmaps in the future. And
Erica?
sorry.
Yeah, sorry, maybe just to add on to that. I think this increasingly it is grid resilience is really important. And, you know, I think in Matt's area down in the Southeast, it's, if you're going to go electric big time with your fleet, you're going to want to have backup power and grid resilience. We had a situation in California this summer where the grid was overtaxed because of the heat, and one transit operator had to stop operating its electric buses during the middle of the day because they couldn't get enough electricity from the grid. So I do think that increasingly having that backup power, the microgrid system is going to be super important in this whole value equation. So to the extent that you know, the members of SEPA and others can help participate and support that, I think it's going to be very important.
Yeah, I would just add, you know, as we, you know, we're sort of deep in the weeds on some really technical stuff about the grid that fleet operators in particular may not want any part of, right? They want the vehicles to go where they need to go, as far as they need to go at the time that they need to go there. And so I think that there is an opportunity, as you say, John, for firms in this space to be bundling these services, making it easy, and ensuring that the customer is getting what they need. I'm not sure that those customers really care about, getting into sort of how they can optimize their charging. They just want to do it at the lowest cost possible that still meets the use case. So I think that when it comes to communications with customers about this, as much as we can do to make it simple, make it bundled, and not get into all of the complexities that we know, are operating behind the scenes, the better off we'll be.
It's a really good point. And I think, yeah, to calibrate to what the consumers are demanding is really critical. I want to pivot quite a bit to something that all of us are probably aware of, which is California's new 100% ZEV sales target by 2035 that the governor signed as an executive order recently. Do you all think that goal should be applied nationally, regionally, or kind of a case-by-case basis? And I'll start with Chris.
Well, I'm actually really interested in John's answer to this question, but I think the fact that California leads a coalition of 13 states in setting its own vehicle emissions standards certainly implies that other states will follow suit when that happens. We've already seen in the last week or so a report from New Jersey, for example, which is calling for light-duty vehicle fleet, all light-duty vehicles to be electric by 2035, and that's clearly taking on board the California order. So I think we will see other states issue this kind of thing. I mean, it's really a bigger issue, isn't it? Because worldwide, you're seeing everything from manufacturers saying we're not going to make diesel engines anymore, to other companies like VW saying we're all in on electric, to certain states or even cities or countries saying we're just going to ban internal combustion engines by a certain date. And then you have these other kind of more interim targets saying, well, this type of fleet must be fully electrified by 2028 or 2030 or whatever. So in my view, everything is kind of moving in that direction. It'll vary a little bit from place to place. Maybe one state has a certain kind of fleet target for 2035 and another has something, less binding. But once you expand the scope of your awareness to kind of the whole domain of vehicles and the drive to decarbonize transportation, it all starts to sort of coalesce, and you realize that, no matter what your target is or what specific vehicle segment you're aiming at or whatever, this is all happening in the next 15 years, more or less. That's it might as well be tomorrow, as far as fleet turnover goes, where vehicles are going to last 10 years at least, in many cases, where utility IRP plans happen over multiple years and so on. I mean, basically, I think whatever the target is, whatever the state is, whatever the city is, you need to be acting now is what it comes down to.
John, would you like to add on to that?
Sure. I think what Governor Newsom did with that executive order for California was incredibly important. I think a lot of people were planning to push for something like that. That was going to be a process that was take place over a 2-year proceeding. All of a sudden it happened overnight, and California is now on that path. And as Chris said, other states are likely to follow that. The automakers really like it when there's one national standard. Certainly a lot depends on this upcoming election, and will there be a federal government that wants to collaborate with California and the other states and on one national standard, or will there be continued fighting and bickering and lawsuits on that front? So a lot depends on the election. I think it's an excellent starting point for a national discussion. We're just reaching out to our members now and seeing if that's something that they want to embrace and they can support. One thing that's really important to understand about the fundamentals of the EV industry, we've been in this business for over 28 years. We've seen a lot of startup manufacturers come and go. A lot of them weren't well capitalized. And what we're seeing now are well capitalized startups, certainly with Tesla, Rivian following right behind. And then there's Arrival, which is UPS is contracted to build their 10,000 electric vans for them. So a lot of very well capitalized startups. And I think we're going to see companies that are only manufacturing battery electric vehicles pushing ahead. They're not burdened by legacy thinking, dealerships and the like. They're going to move really fast. They're going to get the other automakers to move fast as well. So in short, I think it's a great starting point, and we're checking with our membership to see if we can all rally around that goal.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Elizabeth or Matt, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
No, please.
No, well, it has certainly jump-started the conversation in Florida. I mean, one of the reasons that we are even having a statewide comprehensive EV roadmap process is because the legislature passed a bill, 7018, that sort of says, right, we're going to work on things like grid resilience. How do we have a more sustainable and resilient transportation sector? Florida, it's no secret, we get hurricanes, right? And in addition to that, right, we also, in normal times or good times, we can expect 100 million plus visitors a year. So the same routes that facilitate evacuation also facilitate tourism. So there's a business development case in Florida that's sort of the decarbonizing the transportation sector has followed behind, certainly near and dear to my heart. But, if we're talking about encouraging the expansion of electric vehicle use in the state, identifying barriers to adoption, developing an implementation strategy for expanding EV use and EVSE deployments in the state, which is what the bill tasks the executive agencies with doing. Clearly, they're looking around for a starting point, right? And they turned to California as a model, and in fact asked me how radical they could get in terms of their proposals, and specifically cited the 2035 goal. So just to put a big check mark or a +1 next to that, John, California's bold approach has certainly had an impact here on Florida, all the way across the continent. So I think that it's certainly going to be something that we've got to take into account, right? There are very strong market signals out there, and if as a state, as a market, if we don't make some changes to sort of the way that we approach transportation electrification, the innovation, the model availability for vehicles, the availability for EVSE to be deployed here is going to be seriously curtailed. So all of that is just a fair point to both of you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to add 2 points. The first is that, one of Oregon's senators, Senator Jeff Merkley, introduced a bill in the Senate last week, the Zero Emissions Vehicle Act, which would set a national standard that would get us to 100% ZEV sales of light duty by 2035. And so, obviously that's not going anywhere in today's Senate, let alone with today's administration. But I think that we start to see just the level of ambition shifting, which I think is a very, very good thing, because we need to move really, really fast. The other thing that I think we're seeing, obviously, is, with these well-capitalized startups, sort of the rise of the special purpose acquisition companies, and that impacting the TE space. And I think we're seeing markets move more nimbly and being willing to take on a little bit more risk because they see potential upside there. And I think that that's an important shift as well.
Great. And we only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to give everybody like 30 to 40 seconds to wrap up your comments and remarks for our panel today. And with the lens of this question that we just got in about the California governor's executive order to get folks aligned with the urgency of the response to climate change. So with that in mind, do you guys have any further things that you wanted to add? And I'll start with John.
Okay, thanks, Erica. We'll just say that I am really excited about the opportunity to really merge efforts between renewable power and the clean transportation industry. Now is the time we need to move forward to not only get more zero emission transportation out there, but make sure that it's coming from clean, renewable sources. So really excited about the opportunity. We want to engage more with companies from the solar renewable sector. So look forward to that. Also just want to plant just one last seed, which is the Europeans and Chinese and South Koreans have gotten off to a great start with battery technology. I think it's time for the US to get in the game and not give up on that. We've got some great technology, some great opportunity there.
Great, thanks, John. Chris.
Well, with your forbearance, I'm going to just roll out my my dusty old joke that we don't have a chicken and egg problem. We have a chicken and waffles problem. There are lots of vehicles coming, and so we should stop waffling and build some charging stations. This is a real issue. I just think, because I've been following this stuff for 15 years, right? So I think about all the pushback that we got, the oil industry talking points in particular, that, subsidizing or supporting the electrification of vehicles was somehow a cost shift from poor folks to rich Tesla owners, that EVs were just always going to be too expensive, that the grid couldn't handle the load, that, on a coal heavy grid, it was just as bad or worse to drive an EV as it is to drive a conventional vehicle, and so on. All those talking points are just dropping like flies all of a sudden. Like just in the last year or so, we have the evidence that electric vehicles are ready for prime time, that they're affordable, that good vehicle grid integration is possible, that electric vehicles provide us a really crucial path to decarbonizing the transportation sector, which is the sector of the economy with the most emissions. And that, the automakers, the utilities, the consumers, everybody is finally getting aligned. And I think that these state announcements, like we saw from Governor Newsom, are an early indicator that that's happening and that we really are getting into the prime time moment here. So I'm really excited about it. It's never been a better time to be involved in transportation electrification.
Great, thank you. Matt and Elizabeth, real quick, because we're actually over time a little bit.
Gotcha. Yeah, no. Well, it's no secret that Florida is probably the most vulnerable state to climate change in the country. So we are going to need islandable EVSE that run off of renewable storage, that or run off of renewable energy, that have a battery storage component to them. So check us out. Check out Drive Electric Florida. I mean, we are a big market. We've got a large population, and the number of highway miles to drive from Pensacola to Key West is about 15 miles shorter than it is to drive from Pensacola to Chicago. So there is a lot of highway mileage, and we've got to move a lot of people around. So if you have treasure or talent or time, please give me a call, find out what we can do to help and ways that we can work together. The only way this is going to get done is with a shared vision where everyone works strategically and collaboratively. Would love to be a part of that. So that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, I would just say, I think there are two chicken and waffle problems. The first is the vehicles and the charging, and the second is decarbonize and electrify. And we've got to do them both. And we're not going to get where we need to go without each of those. And decarbonization is the thing that adds value tremendously to transportation electrification, and transportation electrification is what technically enables more decarbonization of the grid. So I think it's a really, that's another chicken and waffles problem.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you all so much for this fantastic panel. I personally very much enjoyed this conversation. I hope you did too. And thanks to everybody for attending this session. We will now have a 15-minute commercial break before starting our next live session. And thank you so much for participating in our very first official Electric Vehicle International. Have a great afternoon.